I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network, chatting with writers and authors who offer an added perspective for our listeners. This is Color Between the Lines. Today, we're talking with Dr. Teresa Canada. She is a professor in the Education and Educational Psychology Department at Western Connecticut State University. Her book is Desegregation of the New York City Schools, a story of the Silk Stocking Sisters. Professor Canada gives us a glimpse into what it was like to be a student to help desegregate New York City schools. This book talks about the desegregation of New York City schools beginning in the late 1950s and early 1960s. She's interviewed other students who were also part of the change and allows them to share their stories while giving a history of that era. Welcome, Professor Canada, to the BIN.
Thank you, Ms. Dillard. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Well, I really thought this was an interesting narrative because many people know about the Little Rock Nine and how those children desegregated schools in the South and the backlash and the nasty protests, but it's little talked about the change in the North, such as the 1954 New York City school boycott. I've read in rethinkschools.org that it was one of the largest school protests and boycotts in the North, but you don't hear about this. Is that one of the reasons why that inspired you to write this book?
Oh, absolutely. People asked me before, I said I wanted to document the history because it was an unknown situation. It was very little research available. And in particular, I wanted to document information about the experiences that the young girls in the book, which included myself, went through, which was quote unquote an experiment. It wasn't traditional. So it was a very different situation. And like I said before, I'm a researcher, so I had to actually research what was going on. And as part of my research, I learned that, New York City schools was trying to desegregate the schools during the late 50s and early 60s, up into the middle 60s. And one of the things they did was in certain school districts, they wanted to make sure there was more, quote unquote, students of color, specifically Black and Puerto Rican students at the time, because that was the largest group of diverse students at the time in the New York City public schools. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to make sure that they were overcrowded in the sections where they're mostly Black and Puerto Rican students. Mm-hmm. So what I learned that there was a system set up in the school system where they had feeder schools and sender schools. And what they did, sender schools were schools where students were going to be sent out of their neighborhoods to go into other school districts who were feeder schools, meaning that they would accept those students mm-hmm. In their school districts and in their schools. Well, the school that I attended, which I thought was one of those, receiver schools, wasn't in the documentation in New York City archives for the Board of Education at the time. It was called Board of Education. Now it's a different title for the schools in New York City, but at that time it was the New York City Board of Education. There was no documentation at all about what I had gone through and my colleagues had gone through. So I said, what's going on here? Why isn't my school listed as one of the feeder schools? And I was out of one of the sender schools. Now the school I attended initially was a sender school, mm-hmm. but it wasn't supposed to be sent to the school that I attended. So that's why I asked you to say, I think I need to do some research. And I think I want to write about this experience. And in particular, I call it an experiment because I did interview one of the teachers who's still alive now, believe it or not, who said that the school that I ended when I left my neighborhood Harlem school, the school that I actually was sent to, they selected the students who were going to come to that school. So it wasn't part of the New York City Board of Education's list of schools that were going to run us. And that's really what prompted me to tell the story about what took place, because it wasn't very typical as was documented in the New York City Board of Education archives.
Do you think it was because it was the richer side of town and perhaps they kind of did it off the books kind of thing?
Well, from what I understand is that they selected the students who were going to come to that particular school. The school that is still in existence to this day is still a premier school within the New York City schools. It's still to this day a premier school. Okay, And the neighborhood in which it's located in was, and it still is, a premier neighborhood. And I believe they were selective because they wanted to make sure, and this is quote, I'm paraphrasing the teacher who I interviewed for the book, who was one of the teachers who was at the school that I left.
Mm-hmm.
She said that the school wanted the students who were going to be sent to that particular school, PS6, they want us to fit in to the upper middle class environment that we were going into. Okay. Now, what that meant, I have no idea. I mean, I was a child, I have no idea what that meant. But at the same time, I know that all the parents, and I talk about this, and I think I even wrote an article about the significance of parents,
mm-hmm.
community, in many cases, churches and friends supported us as we entered this particular school. If there were no parent involvement, we would not have been probably even chosen to go to the school. But the key thing is this: when I said we were going to fit in, it wasn't just fitting in terms of whatever I get. It wasn't definitely economically, because it was a huge, significant difference between the students who were there mm-hmm. and those of us who were coming in from the other schools. The key was that many of the students, and I know for myself, I was a third grader reading at eighth grade level. I knew this. Okay. So reading and math levels were significant. They didn't want children to come to the school who were going to impact negatively on their academic standing.
Right.
And that was crucial. Now, if we didn't fit in socially, that didn't bother them. What they didn't want to lower their standards as one of the premier public schools in the New York City system. So that, I think, was crucial. So there's no question in my mind. Like I said, I knew when I was reading, I was a third grader, and I knew I was reading at the eighth grade level. Right. Okay, that much I remember. To this day, I don't recall exactly how the process began in terms of my parents being notified or, and I don't know why. I mean, my parents were both still alive when I was writing this book, and I never even questioned to even ask them, right. Well, how did this come about? Were you approached by the school? Did you get a letter from home? I know I know my mother in particular, if it was going to be something that was going to enhance my ability to be successful in education, he was front and center. There's no question. She was front and center. So I'm pretty sure there was some letter or some communication that came from the school that I was attending at the time to say to parents, this is an opportunity, it's going to have this, this, and this. I have no idea what they said, but whatever it was, my mother agreed to it. And that's why I ended up attending PS6. But specifically, there was a test. And I say this because everyone who I know who attended the Black and brown children who came in, we all had some sort of quote unquote test. I know that I did. Mm-hmm. And it was a music or art test. Now, I'm not an artist. I cannot draw to this day. I mean, I'm not an actual artist in that sense, but I did have some musical acumen. My sister and I, my older sister and I were piano players, and we had, concert recitals and, so forth and so on. I was 6 and 7 years old. So that was already taking place. So I already came in with this, already had a sense of musical acumen. So when I took this music test, that's what I was taking, a music test. Apparently I passed the music test. Go figure. But I believe it was a guise just to give a sense of like, okay, maybe, if they have these attributes, it'll be helpful. And having been through the system, knowing what happened when I arrived at PS6, I understood why. PS6 was the premier school for not just music, but also art. And when I mean that, they had a chorus, they had a band, they had an orchestra. So we performed in theatrical kinds of, I was in one of the plays, I think it was The Wizard of Oz. I remember that. I think I played, I don't know what role I played, but I know it wasn't a starring role, but I know I was in the play. But they had the most artistically demanding, theoretical, how should I say? Theatrical. Not theoretical, but in sense of the theatrical setup was like you're off Broadway, close to Broadway. That's how, between the costume and the staging, the lighting, the music, everything. Fabulous. Okay.
If you are just joining us, we're speaking with Dr. Teresa Canada, author of the book Desegregation of New York City Schools, a story of the Silk Stocking Sisters. I noticed that many of the experiences the girls shared were about their relationships in the schools and how they interacted more with the Black and Latino students. The relationships with the white students were perhaps not as deep. And you kind of explained why, because many of them were, as far as socioeconomically, worlds away from the students that were coming from the Black community. And I remember one student, Monique, saying that she often edited herself around the white students. She wouldn't share much of the personal stuff, just school stuff. Do you think that even though this was a desegregation experiment of sorts, the school experience reinforced the feeling of other for the girls than feeling part of that school and part of that community?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question. We were in a situation where we sometimes we felt like fish out of water, and we would return to our communities. Of course, we lived in certain communities, which was not part of the PS6 community, and in a sense, we were outliners even within our communities because people knew we didn't attend the local schools, and that was an issue. But there were people who supported us. And said, okay, you can do this, you can keep going. They would see us waiting for the bus in the mornings, all those things that were encouraging. But at the same time, we just missed out on, it's like we missed out on the kind of connectiveness we would have had within our community. We were seen as different within our community, but we still supported each other when we knew we had to go and fight the battles when we attended PS6 every day. We knew we had to fight those battles. And we were not going to give up. That's the key. We knew we had to be successful. That's just interesting. We knew we could do this. We knew we had to, and we stuck together despite everything, despite the commuting, despite, not being selected as monitors, and the point where many people felt like, well, if we had all the same kinds of equipment and the same kinds of, they had kitchens and we had home economics and, we barely had a schoolyard where I attended before I did that. We barely had a schoolyard. We had to convert the lunchroom into inside gymnasium. Yeah. So it was a complete distinct difference in terms of facilities and equipment. You mentioned about the experience. If the parents really knew the experience that many of us had, they would have taken us out of the school.
Yeah. Because they would have felt like the psychological
share everything.
The psychological impact of that experience on the children. And I wondered what your assessment of that was when you talked to all the other ladies. Did you see that there was, did they express that they felt like that impacted their lives as far as some of that psychological impact of feeling not a part of that school community or part of their own Black community?
Yes, it was a clear distinction. I have a chapter in the book called Of Heart and Mind, and I talk about the psychological impact of desegregation. And there were studies that showed that people never reached out and thought about how it impacted students from a psychological point of view. For some reason, I say that because as my training also as a licensed professional counselor, it's because we're always placed in situations and we're just deal with it, all right? And that really is what we decided to do. Well, how do we do this? How do we become successful? How do we keep moving in this process? And that's what we chose to do. But definitely there was some issues. To this day, I'm concerned about the fact that the whole desegregation process, and many schools are now more desegregated than they were back in the 60s. What is the psychological damage that takes place? How do you circumvent that if you can? Okay. I was able to be okay because I believe my strong family setting made a difference. Okay. And for me also, my friendship with the friends that I had, and we would connect with each other. We would stay in touch. So that helped me. But not everyone felt that way. One of my friends, she hated the experience from day one. She hated everything about the experience. That's what she says. To this day, she says that. And it's not like she was able to not only survive, she thrived. She was able to still get through, and she did well, and so forth and so on. But my point, I'm just saying to you, though, is that we were, some people were able to be accepted in their neighborhoods where they live, but not all of us. Okay. I was an outsider in my neighborhood. I mean, people knew I went to another school, I attended another school, or I lived in the neighborhood, but I kind of was like, you were on the fence. Some things you could participate in the neighborhood, some things you couldn't participate. Okay. So, that was something that you have to juggle, because not only was it PS6, because once we left PS6, many of us still attended schools outside of our neighborhoods, even for 7th, 8th, and 9th grade, and some of us even into high school. So it's a choice if you're able to make the choice. And many of us don't understand how we were able to still keep going, despite all the rejections, despite all the discriminatory practices, some of the discriminatory practices that were taking place. There was some senses of some teachers were trying to include you and so forth, but it was very limited. I mean, you could see it from like the plays and, but if you excelled at something, that's interesting. If you excelled at something, you've got credit for it. Okay.
Right. I'm just wondering, final question, if some of this information and through this book, you are perhaps hoping others will apply to our present situation in other situations when it comes to children and their education and their experience and being able to help them, on a social and psychological level, being able to understand from your experience, be able to apply some of those lessons to them.
Right now, the majority of people who are attending public schools in this country are people of color. The majority, there's no question. That wasn't always, wherever you live, the basic standards, wherever you live, you go to school near where you live. And I'll tell you, even to this day, there's still a lot of that residential segregation exists. So wherever you live is where you basically attend school. Today, not much has changed, but the change is that the school system is predominantly people of color across the board. Asians, Blacks, Latinos, it's across the board. Okay, public schools in this country, New York City in particular. How are you able to desegregate, quote unquote, a school unless the initial rationale for school integration was that you always had to have the majority of white students and maybe a few sprinkling of students of color. That was integration. That was acceptable integration. Would it be okay if you have a majority Black and brown children and just a minority of white students in the class? That's not considered desegregation.
Wow. So
that's the question I put out there. All the women who were in this book became very successful in their own rights. They professors, a pediatrician, a pharmaceutical executive, school psychologist, social worker. So it wasn't, a sales executive for a Fortune 100 company. So I'm just saying to you, these are women who went through PS6 experience. And someone had to ask me this question. I knew it was coming up, and I'll just share this with the audience. Someone said, well, why didn't you talk about the Black male students? I said, because they didn't stay. They were so few and they didn't stay. The pressures were bad enough on us, but it's even worse on the Black and brown male students, okay? 1 or 2 stayed, but the majority did not stay. And I can understand that, okay? Because the experience it wasn't really inclusive, all right? And we just were there just to fill a slot, to fulfill the financial wherewithal so the school could still be in existence in that neighborhood. So that's why, I would love to, there's one woman in chat talks about, she begged the last Black guy in her class, please don't leave her. Don't leave me. Because she was the only Black female in the class. She said, don't leave me. Please don't leave me. Oh boy. And he said, I can't deal with this. I got to go. And he left as well. They didn't even go through the whole school year. So those are the dynamics. If you thought it was bad for women who are in the book, it was even 10
Worse.
times worse for the Black males.
Yep.
Simple as that. Okay. So those are some of the issues, because you think about it, they're coming into this neighborhood. Just the walk from the bus stop to the school was traumatic. Okay. What are they doing in this neighborhood? Okay. And leaving school to wait and catch the bus, standing at the bus stop. What are you doing standing in front of this building? It was like those kinds of interactions that were subtle that people never thought about. But it does impact you, and how you approach, how you looked at. Even going to the local restaurants, or if you chose, even that was looked upon as like, what are you doing walking in here?
Yeah.
What are you doing walking in here? Not even to purchase. What are you doing walking in here?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
Those are that, and not much of that has changed. I had to say that, but that was really prominent, and that's why I said they chose, to leave and be someplace where they can feel supported or not feel that as much pressure they were getting if they were coming to the school. And it is what it is.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Teresa Canada, for sharing with us about your book. It's called Desegregation of the New York City Schools, a story of the Silk Stocking Sisters. You can find it on Amazon. That's it for this edition of Color Between the Lines. I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network.